Hello, everyone. Welcome to Developmental Psychology, DEP 2004. I am Dr. Rivera. All right, guys, in this set of videos, I'm just going to talk about a few topics. I'm not going to go over every single topic in chapter 2 and 3, but I am going to try to hit on some of the topics that people usually have questions about. Now, I want to talk a little bit about mitosis and meiosis. First of all, mitosis occurs when the cell splits into two. So during mitosis, and specifically during the S phase of mitosis, an enzyme called helicase will unwind the DNA. And then, as it is unwound and split into two, the cell will replicate the other half of each side of the DNA. Now, another enzyme is going to attach itself to each nucleotide and replicate the other half of the DNA. And it does this by the pairing rule that occurs. Adenine always binds to thymine. And so if there's an adenine nucleotide, then a thymine nucleotide has to be on the other side. If there is a cytosine nucleotide, then on the other side, the side that is being created, there has to be a guanine nucleotide there. And so in doing this over and over again, it replicates the entire chromosome. You see here an animation of the DNA splitting up. And at the top, you can kind of see how, say, the DNA is folded onto itself and then sort of folded again around the chromatin to sort of create the chromosome. And that has to be split open and then separated into two. And then, of course, the cell will replicate the missing parts. Now, when this is happening, if a mistake occurs in the way the DNA is being replicated, then a mutation can occur. Now, a mutation could just occur in that one cell, but if it occurs in somewhere that can be passed down, it'll likely continue to be passed down generation after generation. And that's quite important, and especially when we talk about meiosis. So in mitosis, the DNA is replicated and the cell is split into two, so that there are two sister cells. But in meiosis, what happens is that the chromosomes are split. But instead of creating two sister cells that are complete and have a complete set of DNA, instead, what is created are haplocells in meiosis. And those haplocells only have half of the DNA. Now, if you are a male, then your haplocells are going to be sperm cells. And if you are a female, your haplocells are going to be ova. And if you're a female, all of the eggs, all of the ova that you will have throughout your life are created from birth. You have all of them in your ovaries from birth. Whereas if you are a male, a genetic male, then throughout your life, you will create new sperm. And these sperm and the egg will come together in the uterus in order to create one full cell with 23 pairs of chromosomes, as opposed to just having 23 single chromosomes. Now you'll see there the term autosomes. Autosomes are the first 22 pairs of chromosomes, and the last pair of chromosomes are your sex chromosomes. And those are the ones that we usually call X or Y. And we'll talk a little bit more deeply about that. Here you can see the autosomes, 1 through 22. And you'll notice that for the most part, the chromosome that you get from mom looks very similar or identical to the chromosome that you get from dad. That's not going to be true for your sex chromosomes. Now, your autosomes are not exactly the same. Obviously, you're getting different sets of genes, but they're going to be very similar. So that if one allele can be found in the chromosome you get from mom, let's say chromosome number 8 that you get from mom, well, that same allele is going to be found in dad's chromosome. Now, it might be slightly different because dad is giving you a different set of genes, but they should both do the same thing, or that allele is going to be doing the same thing, even if it's coming from mom or dad, or even if it's slightly different. The same is not true in your sex chromosomes. Now, if you are a female, you have two X chromosomes. If you're a genetic female, then you have two X chromosomes. And so, therefore, both of your X chromosomes are going to look rather similar. It's going to be similar to all the other autosomes. But if you're a male, your X chromosome looks very different than your Y chromosome. And you can tell here that a man's Y chromosome is actually very little compared to the X chromosome that you get from mom. If you're a gentleman, you get your X chromosome from mom and your Y chromosome from dad. Um, and the Y chromosome you get from dad is clearly missing a lot of information. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that means for men in just a little bit. First, I want to talk a little bit about alleles and passing on traits. Now, an allele is a set of genes that have one function. They might, for example, determine, let's say, your eye color. Now, I think it's important to point out that there are very few traits where one allele or one set of alleles controls it entirely. That's just not really the way the body works. Um, and most traits have several alleles that will do X or Y or B or C, and all together they work to create a specific trait. And yet, there are a few traits that you can kind of trim down to what one allele is doing. Eye color is one of these things. Now, so the allele is a specific set of genes that is doing a specific trait or is controlling a specific trait. Now, you'll notice also that alleles can be homozygous or heterozygous. If your alleles are homozygous, it means that the allele you got from mom is similar or the same as the allele you got from dad. So, for example, if you look at this picture here, you might notice that it says lowercase b, lowercase b. Well, that means that in this scenario, let's say dad has homozygous recessive alleles. They're homozygous because they're both the same. Lowercase b, lowercase b. That means that they are both recessive. Recessive in this case means that they are the trait that is not dominant. And so, in order to demonstrate it, in order to show that trait, you have to have two recessive alleles. If you look down here, you'll notice that it is a capital B and a capital B. This would also be considered homozygous. In this case, it would be homozygous dominant. Homozygous because they're both capital letters. That is, they're both the same. The one you got from mom is similar to the one you got from dad. And dominant because they're both uppercase, meaning they are the trait that is going to take over. Now, not all people have homozygous alleles. In fact, probably many of your alleles are going to be heterozygous. That means you get one from mom and you get a different one from dad. It's a different allele. It's for the same thing, for the same trait, but it's doing something slightly different. And so if you look at this person over here, and I'll show you this slightly bigger in just a moment, but this is an uppercase B, lowercase b. That means that, let's say, mom in this scenario has a heterozygous alleles. Heterozygous meaning different, the capital B and then a lowercase b. That means she has one dominant allele and one recessive allele. Again, dominant alleles are the alleles that you express. If you have brown eyes, that means that you must have at least one dominant allele for brown eyes. And so even if you have an allele for blue eyes, the dominant trait has covered the recessive trait. And the recessive traits are not expressed unless you have both recessive traits. So if you have blue eyes, you have to have two recessive alleles, one that you got from mom and one that you got from dad. Now, if you are heterozygous or if you have heterozygous alleles, that means that you might be a carrier. Maybe you have brown eyes, but you might be able to pass down that recessive allele. And depending on who your spouse is or who the person that you're having a baby with is and what kind of alleles they have, you might be able to pass down blue eyes to your child, even though you yourself have brown or black eyes. Here you kind of see the combination possibilities, and I'm going to sort of break this down into a Punnett square in just a minute. But you can see that mom in this case has heterozygous alleles, one capital, meaning dominant, and one lowercase, meaning recessive. Therefore, she can pass down either her dominant trait or she can pass down her recessive trait. And in this case, dad also has heterozygous alleles, one dominant, one recessive, which means he can pass down his dominant trait or his recessive trait. Now, in order to get those blue eyes, what is what they're representing here, um, this child has to have mom's recessive allele and dad's recessive allele. Otherwise, if the child gets two dominant alleles, they're going to have brown eyes. And if they have heterozygous alleles, one dominant, one recessive, they're likely also going to have brown eye. Now, usually, especially if you're taking biology, you're going to end up doing a Punnett square like this. And I'm not going to do a lot with Punnett squares, but I do want you to have an idea of how they work and what they mean. So, if mom and dad both have heterozygous alleles, one dominant, one recessive, well, you're just going to take one and put it in each box. In this case, we put dad's dominant trait on top and his recessive trait underneath. And we're going to do the same thing for mom, but at the top. We're going to put her dominant trait on the left and her recessive trait on the right. And this is just kind of like if you're multiplying, like a multiplication table. And so you're going to take dad's uppercase B and mom's uppercase B, and you're going to put them together. There's dad's dominant trait and mom's dominant trait. And then for the next one, we're going to take dad's dominant trait and mom's recessive trait. For the left bottom square, we're going to take mom's dominant allele and dad's recessive allele. And then for the bottom right, we're going to take mom's recessive allele from the top and dad's recessive allele from the bottom. And again, what you're seeing here is the same thing you saw at the top. Here, this child is going to have brown eyes. This person we would call dominant homozygous. That is, their alleles are homozygous, and this person has dominant alleles. Both of them are. And therefore, they're going to end up with brown eyes. This individual is going to have heterozygous alleles, but they're still dominant because that capital B is going to cover the lowercase b or the recessive trait. And the same thing is going to be true for this individual. This person is going to be dominant but heterozygous. And again, that dominant capital letter B is going to cover up the recessive lowercase b. And the only way to really end up with blue eyes is the last square there, where the individual ends up having two recessive alleles. Now, sometimes people wonder, how does one trait cover the other one? And usually it's not that complicated. So if we look at eyes, for example, if you have two dominant alleles, what happens is that first capital B, that first dominant trait, let's say you get that from mom, it tells the eye to make a lot of pigment. Make a lot of pigment. And so your eye makes a lot of pigment. And that second allele that you got from dad, well, that one is also telling the eye to make a lot of pigment. And so the eye makes more pigment. And so what ends up happening that this individual ends up with brown eyes because when the light from the sun or the lamp hits your eyes, the pigment in your eye absorbs all of that light or most of that light. And in absorbing the light, they don't allow it to bounce back out. And so the eyes end up looking dark brown or black. Now, if you have heterozygous alleles, well, what ends up happening is that one of your alleles, let's say the one you got from mom, that capital letter B, is telling your eyes to make a lot of pigment. And then the one you got from dad is telling your eye to make just a little bit of pigment. And there it is. You can maybe see a few of those smaller brown pigments are sort of popping up. And they're not really that much. They're very little. But it doesn't really matter because the dominant allele is still telling your eyes to make a lot of pigment. And so it still covers up the little bit of pigment that you make because of dad's allele in this scenario. Well, it doesn't matter. It's just adding to the amount of brown that you already have. Now, if you have two recessive alleles, what ends up happening is that one of those alleles tells your eyes to make just a little bit of pigment. And then the other allele tells your eyes to make just a little bit of pigment too. And so it's just a tiny bit of pigment. And so now this person's eyes are going to end up looking blue. Now, people will sometimes ask, wait a second, if the dominant allele is making brown or dark pigment, and the recessive allele is also making dark pigment, just less of it, then how do we end up getting blue eyes? Well, humans don't make the color blue. There's, in fact, very few animals on Earth that make the color blue in any form, in any pigment form. There's like a butterfly, and I think there's like one primate. Very few animals make the color blue. Instead, what happens is that if you look at an eye very closely, you'll notice that the eye actually has a lot of texture. So when the light hits the eye, well, if it doesn't have a lot of pigment in the eye, a lot of that light is just going to bounce back out. And because of the texture of the eye, the light, as it bounces out of your eye, it just kind of scatters. And what ends up happening is that if you have very little pigment, well, maybe some of that yellow, maybe some of that red gets absorbed. And once it bounces out and gets scattered, the light coming out of your eyes or bouncing off of your irises ends up looking blue or ends up looking green. Now, if you have a lot of pigment in your eye, well, it doesn't matter that the light is getting scattered because too much of that light is getting absorbed into the pigment. And so the little bit that escapes is just going to end up looking, brown because there's just not enough light to create any other color. Now, if you have certain mutations in your eyes, then maybe your dominant alleles don't make a whole lot. They make more than the recessive alleles, but they don't make too much. And so maybe you end up having more hazel eyes, where depending on how the light hits your eye, then more might bounce out. And so you might get a little bit more of that scattering and you'll get sort of a hazel color. And sometimes you might get even to like a grayish or a greenish color, depending on the light. But if you have those recessive alleles, well, not enough of that light is getting absorbed. And so when it bounces back out and gets scattered, what ends up happening is you end up having eyes that look blue, even though there is no pigmentation in your eye that is blue. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. Let me know if you have any questions. And remember that the best way to contact me is directly through Canvas. I hope to hear from you soon.